Welcome to the Regenerative Brands podcast. This is a place for consumers, operators, and investors to learn about the consumer brands supporting regenerative agriculture and how they're changing the world. This is your host, Kyle, joined by my co-host, AC, who's going to take us into the episode.
On this episode, we have James Arthur Smith, who is the founder and CEO of Seatopia. Seatopia is supporting regenerative aquaculture with its direct-to-consumer business, building consumer demand for innovative aquaculture practices in hopes of scaling a truly regenerative seafood supply chain to feed the planet and restore our oceans. In this episode, James breaks down the massive problems with current commodity seafood systems, how Seatopia is pioneering aquaculture 3.0, and why integrated multi-trophic aquaculture in the ocean is the same thing as regenerative agriculture on the land. If you're ready to take a deep dive, pun intended, into marine ecosystems and planet-positive commercial-scale food production, then this episode is for you. Let's dive in. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Regen Brands podcast. Very excited today to have our friend James from Seatopia with us. So welcome, James.
Honored to be here. Let's do this.
James, we're super stoked. I'm personally super stoked. I didn't tell you this during our pre-conversation, but I'm a former dive master, fellow freediver. So talking about anything ocean related, this is right in my wheelhouse. I'm really excited to talk about this.
Good.
But before we go too far, help our audience understand, what sort of products you produce and where can people find you today?
Seatopia is providing certified clean seafood, mostly sushi grade, yellowtail, salmon, king salmon, some Atlantic salmon, scallops. These are Peruvian scallops on a half shell. Branzino, barramundi, things like that. And it's all portioned for individual consumption in individual vacuum bags. We sell frozen, but not traditionally frozen. We sell super frozen, so like nitrogen frozen, vacuum sealed, and we sell direct to consumer, only available online. Our website is seatopia.fish, so sushi grade seafood. But one of the interesting things about everything we do is that we put a certificate of analysis on all of our products. So we microplastics test, we mercury test, we test omega-3 levels. The level of assurity that our customers have because of the certificate analyses that are available transparent on our website makes Seatopia as a brand a unique offering of certified clean seafood.
Hell yeah.
Incredible. I'm already ready to buy. That was enough for me. We'll still do the whole episode, but I'm ready to purchase.
Right on. I mean, it resonates with a lot of people, especially if they're, health conscious foodies.
Yeah. And I feel like, for me in preparing for this, I learned a lot more, and it took me back to when I started learning about regen from a land-based agriculture perspective. So we've had some kelp-based brands, but really that was just kind of single crop focus, I guess, in the aquaculture world. And this seems to be much more expansive. And so just really, really kind of cool. I feel like opened a new filing cabinet in my brain, so to speak. And I'm also feeling a little bit threatened because I got a couple guys on here that have more oceanic experience than me. But we're gonna set that aside. James, this is kind of a deep personal quest for you that has a lot of personal and formal work experience tied into it. So I guess just take us back to kind of your background and also how Seatopia came to be.
Well, the ocean welcomes all, so don't feel intimidated, Anthony. You are also of an ocean background. We all come from this origin of the ocean. Yes. So, we have this place there. That's why we're all connected to it in a uniquely romantic and genetic way. My story is that I was brainwashed into being a water baby. My dad was a lifeguard. I grew up on the ocean. Like his idea of taking care of us was just taking us to work. And, as little kids, we were just like underneath the lifeguard tower running around on the beach. On the other spectrum, my mother worked at SeaWorld. And this is, wow, 40 years ago, right? So it's a different era. Shamu was amazing back then. We didn't realize, confinement of these creatures was such horrible slavery to huge hugely emotionally intelligent animals. But I had the opportunity, because she worked there, to sort of get behind the scenes access and spend time with some of the trainers and some of the animals. And I just fell in love. And I, from a very young age was like, I want to be a Shamu trainer. And then I need to get work experience. And I started volunteering at an aquarium. And at the aquarium, I learned about aquaculture and the ideas of restorative aquaculture, and this idea was planted on a path that matured many, many years later.
Wow.
But if we get more into how I got into aquaculture specifically and Seatopia, it's worth it, I think, even clarifying for your audience. One of the unique things about Seatopia is that we do not source any wild-caught seafood. It is 100% aquaculture. But what we're doing that's very different than traditional aquaculture is that Seatopia is this niche product, this niche sales channel that is designed to support artisan aquaculture projects that are not necessarily applicable for the commodity distribution channel. So I ended up working at a farm in the Sea of Cortez that was raising these beautiful yellowtail, this Seriola rivaliana, some of the most beautiful sushi grade seafood in the world. This is deep water pens, over 100 feet deep, in turquoise water, swimming with, imagine swimming in an aquarium with 10,000 friendly fish that want to come and rev up against you. That's what Kampachi are. They're really interesting, amazing, and social, sort of social. At least we perceive it as social. And in this process, I realized that while we were doing like low density farming in the best potential location and raising fish using algae based feeds, that once we got into the market and tried to sell it, that we were getting lumped into the same bucket as other farms producing the same species, but with higher density farming practices, with corn and soy feeds, with copper nets that provide, that are fouling heavy metals into the environment. And this lack of optionality and incentive from the buyers, from the distributors, from the importers, just was like a real limitation to the ability to grow and innovate and build a financially sustainable business that was doing best in class aquaculture, truly part of the solution. And this birthed Seatopia through in the short story. I built Seatopia as a sales channel to provide consumers, initially my community, my friends and family that knew about this product, with direct access to the best quality sushi grade seafood that was, raised on an algae rich diet, and, no antibiotics, no hormones, doing it right. The longer form is I also in the interim had to build a wholesale distribution. I had to drive fish. I had to fillet fish. I had to knock on the doors of restaurateurs and bring chefs down there and do events. So, and going further back, I also, prior to that, had a lot of experience in having built an energy bar company that we got to nationwide distribution in Whole Foods through all the distributors, the Kahis and UNFIs and all that stuff. And that experience kind of helped guide me on what I do and don't want to do with Seatopia, and kind of how we're really positioned initially just on building this trusted brand and harvesting this sort of niche direct to consumer segment of audiences, of people.
I'm just picturing James inviting chefs to dive with the 10,000 fish as their buying event.
Dude, it was amazing. It was so fun bringing chefs down there. It is part of the vision of Seatopia, is how do we bring more people to farms? Because the biggest challenge for us is, again, there's this limitation on who you can sell to if people are going to lump all farmed fish into the same bucket, right? To be totally fair, most farm fish is done for commodity distribution, and most farm fish is not something that I would feed my family. The exceptions to the rules would exist and need to be celebrated when you go to a farm like this, it is just a beautiful example of the type of environment that you want to swim with, that makes memories that will last forever, that you take photos and your friends are like, wow, where are you? You know, it's not, you're in a marine protected environment. You're surrounded by thousands of fish and shellfish and kelp and sharks and whale sharks. That's beautiful. I want to go there. And it was awesome. And what we're trying to do with Seatopia is to get more people to realize that there are places that are absolutely beautiful, just like, you know, a lot of people have driven up the 5 freeway in California and smelled these, you know, factory farmed cattle. You know, these feedlots are disgusting, and you would never want to have a picnic there or go for a walk there or live there. But then you get up to Big Sur and you see these beautiful ranches and cattle with an ocean view just roaming around. And you're like, wow, let's have a picnic here. Let's live here. That is the difference between farming practices and intention and sort of outcome. So there are some really, really beautiful farms, like the ones that we're working with in New Zealand or Hawaii or Peru or Mexico. And these places, I hope over time become sort of household brands in the same way that like White Oak Pastures and some of these truly like legendary examples of rotational crops and grazing animals integrated into these agriculture systems. These practices and these farm brands are helping sort of raise the tide, and all ships are raising with like regenerative agriculture. The same thing is starting to happen with aquaculture. There's a handful of these farms that their stories are worth telling, and we're enabling consumers to vote with their dollars for those specific farms and those specific farming practices.
Amen.
James, my brain is having a hard time keeping track of the different directions we can take this conversation. There's like splinters of different like veins we can go down, right? And there's so much to cover.
We got time.
I really appreciate it. We got some time. I was actually going to go towards that beef example that you just provided, how, you know, commodity raised meats for a long time, you know, beef was beef. You know, then there was grass-fed, grass-finished beef, and now there's regenerative beef, and how you can utilize animals to have a positive impact on the ecosystem. And I think you're spot on with that sort of parallel line you're drawing with like the way farm raised is different than aquaculture. But dive into that a little bit more and help our consumers understand like what is like traditional farm raised fish versus what you were doing at Seatopia, and why is it so important, both from like a ecosystem impact perspective and a human nutrition perspective?
Yes. I'm so glad that you asked that, and that those questions are very important, right? So let's talk about, maybe I'll just back up a little bit and give you sort of the history of aquaculture, right? So unlike farming of livestock on land, which we've been doing for thousands of years, farming of fish in the ocean, as far as like raising from eggs to maturity, we've only been doing since the 1970s. There's a rich history in like Hawaii and Asia raising sort of extensive farming practices. Extensive farming is like allowing them just to grow in semi-controlled environments, cultivating an environment where, let's say, phytoplankton or zooplankton, you're kind of like creating an environment for the zooplankton to live, and then those zooplankton and phytoplankton being eaten by larger organisms, and you're creating this environment. That sort of ranching has been going on. Very rich history in Hawaii and Asia and different places. Oftentimes with lower trophic animals, smaller animals, and herbaceous animals. But with what we're talking about with modern aquaculture, raising animals from eggs, literally creating a hatchery. And salmon is salmon, branzino, tilapia, fish that are hardier and have a history of living in varying environmental conditions started first. So if we talk about salmon in the 1970s in Norway, for example, because salmon go from freshwater to saltwater and back and forth, they're a little bit hardier. And because when they're born or when the eggs are laid, there's so much fats and nutrients in that roe. It's literally designed to feed that fingerling for multiple days. It's going to live just on the fat of that. It doesn't need to be fed. It doesn't need to immediately go out and eat. Those were sort of the first commercially scaled carnivorous farms. And what they did when they first started raising these salmon is they said, well, what do the salmon eat in the wild? And let's grind up bait fish, which is what they were eating in the wild, and bring those fish ground up into the farm so that they can literally just eat the same exact nutrients. And so ground up sardines and anchovies turned into feed for these, let's call it fish 1.0, aquaculture 1.0. Aquaculture 2.0, we realized that some of the challenges of scalability in aquaculture was that because in the wild, only 1% of those hundreds of thousands of eggs would survive. And then in a hatchery, you had, let's just call it 90% survival rate. All of a sudden you have this imbalance, right? You have, instead of 1% surviving, you have 90% surviving, but you're still taking from the wild to feed them. So you have an influx of farmed salmon eating a finite supply of wild bait fish. And this imbalance scaling into the 1980s and 90s was alerted to the industry and governments in general, said, hey, let's change the feed so that we actually can build aquaculture as a sustainable component. And what they did in order to relieve pressure on bait fish was they said, let's find alternatives. And industry solved it in a very sort of patriarchal manner. And we said, well, we've done it already on land. We've figured it out. We feed our cows corn and soy. And corn and soy allows them to grow fat, and it doesn't cost a lot, and it's all subsidized. And for the next 10 to 15 years, most of the aquaculture followed that model. And most of aquaculture said, let's feed our carnivorous salmon corn and soy. And they had mixed results. They continued to grow at moderate rates, but just like me and you, increased levels of those seed oils causes inflammation. Those omega-6s cause inflammation in our gut, and it causes inflammation in the salmon's gut, and allows and increases the likelihood of susceptibility to disease. And we had a lot of salmon die-offs, and we had a lot of problems in the aquaculture industry. And you saw also a lot of an increased use of preventative antibiotics being put into the feed. And this now proliferated. So you have, if you look at the studies that were done on farm salmon, you'd see like in the early phases, like the omega-3 levels are really high or even higher than the wild because we are biomagnifying everything into like grinding it up and feed it to them. And they're in a closed environment so that they're using less energy, and they're just these like sort of like in cattle, we have like Kobe beef and things of that nature. You have these really fatty animals, and we were producing these like super fatty, delicious, high omega-3 farm salmon, but also anything else that was in the environment was also bioaccumulating. So things like microplastics, PCBs, mercury levels were also bioaccumulating. And that kind of got resolved when we switched to corn and soy, but that supplemented for a different problem. And those problems are like glyphosates and omega-6s and the need for antibiotics because you're not giving them what they actually need. You're not focusing on their nutritional like density. You're focused on just growing them cheaply. We're today in sort of aquaculture 3.0, thankfully. 3.0 was this evolution in the thinking of, well, how do we just optimize for the healthiest fish so that they don't need the antibiotics to begin with? What can we feed fish that will give them the strongest immune system to begin with and produce the best outcome? And if you go back to the beginning, it's interesting to note that salmon in the wild eating those sardines and anchovies ate something smaller. And if you go down to the very base level, the base trophic level, the microalgae are what's actually giving the salmon the omega-3s that make it delicious, healthy, and nutritious. The traditional health benefits of eating seafood really come down to, there's a lot of things, but the thing that most studies focus on is EPA and DHA. And those heart healthy omega-3s are not biologically produced in salmon. They're bioaccumulated through what it eats. And the omega-3s of EPA and DHA get into that salmon because further down the food chain, the microalgae converted sunlight into these oils. And it is the same process of getting omega-3s into salmon can be bypassed if we just feed them the omega-3 fatty acid oils directly. So aquaculture 3.0 is utilizing farmed microalgae oils to feed directly to these salmon, and then supplementing or replacing the use of fish oil now for microalgae, and replacing the need for fish meal with things like soldier fly proteins and other insect proteins or mycelium proteins. And this is where we're at today, which is how do we develop truly scalable and nutritious feed for aquaculture? And that is sort of a long-winded way of saying commodity salmon, commodity aquaculture is sort of phase 1, phase 2. And there's a lot of that still happening today, but there are a handful of farms that are innovating on using alternative feeds. And it's also worth noting that there's farms that have evolved away from monoculture to polyculture. And that's also really exciting because that's where we get into catalyzing the ecosystem services of multiple organisms in this ecological environment. So to paint a picture, a monoculture, you just have salmon growing in pens, and you're optimizing to keep that environment as clean and sterile as possible, sometimes using chemicals, using antibiotics, and just trying to pretend like this is a laboratory and we control the environment. When we are gods, in this traditional approach. Moderate success, aquaculture today is producing more seafood than wild caught. Granted, wild caught has a lot of problems. It's, overfished, pollution, finite resource, pressure. But at least aquaculture is producing a lot of the seafood. That said, we've seen the downsides of industrial agriculture on land, and applying those same principles to aquaculture is foolish. We need to be a lot more humble and approach aquaculture, in my opinion, in the same way that we're approaching land-based agriculture, that we are stewards of the land, and that, like, cattle farms done right, they're not growing cattle. What they're doing is they're growing the soil, and they're growing the microbes, and they're growing the mycelium network, and they're growing a variety of grasses, and they're trying to create an environment that's attractive for all these different organisms, from birds to badgers, and when done right, they create this healthy environment. And one of the end products is beef that is nutrient dense and rich, but it's all these other organisms. We're doing that in aquaculture today in what we call integrated multi-trophic aquaculture, or polyculture, or mixed species aquaculture. It's really just who are the players. And as you mentioned earlier, kelp is gotten a lot of press over the last few years, which is amazing. We need more press for kelp. It provides ecosystem services in the form of absorbing dissolved particulate out of the environment. It creates habitat for other species. It's a nursery. If you leave it there year round instead of harvesting it all, it actually helps create biodiversity. But that is one ecosystem player. Some of the other ecosystem players in a multi-trophic aquaculture, with salmon used as the example, salmon are carnivorous, so they need to be fed. And if you're going to feed them a clean feed, like the algae-based feeds with the soldier fly larva proteins, their poop is not waste. It is not a toxic environment. It becomes a superfood, a fertilizer that is healthy for the environment, as long as you have partners there. If they're in a monoculture and they're in a high density environment and there's not the right siding and there's not the right circulation, granted, all that poop becomes toxic. It's all about having the right partnership and the right concentration. But there are organisms like shellfish, like deposit feeders, bacteria, microorganisms that all thrive on an environment that has the right balance of nutrients. In the ocean, we have environments that are either like eutrophic or holotrophic, like too much nutrients or not enough nutrients. And dead zones in the ocean that don't have enough nutrients can be brought back to life when you introduce structure, when you introduce nutrients. So creating environments that previously didn't have enough nutrients, for example, to even grow kelp or to grow, let alone something like shellfish, like oysters, mussels, scallops. Pairing those with a fish farm, all of a sudden you have those nutrients and you have the upcycling and you have the filter feeders that are cleaning the water. And when done right, you create structures that can actually act as fish attracting devices, as habitat structure that builds biodiversity in the environment. And I'm not by any means saying that we have it completely figured out, but I'm saying that by following nature's model and fostering the ecosystem services that some of these different organisms do symbiotically work together, we are learning that we can farm in a much different way, and we can start to see the potential abundance that can be created in the oceans, because the oceans are massive. Over 70% of the world on this planet that we call Earth, which is in my opinion a misnomer, it should be oceans, is water. We do not have a lack of land to grow fish. We have a lack of vision to grow ecosystems in a truly beautiful, regenerative, scalable way in the oceans. And so that's kind of where we're at today, is learning how to evolve away from the model that was scaled initially in aquaculture. And the crazy story behind the scenes is that those big farms oftentimes were scaled with the exact same dollars and holding companies that scaled big ag on land. They put the exact same business model into the ocean, but tides are changing. You know, there are a handful of pilot projects. There's a growing awareness for aquaculture done right, for artisan projects that are good stewards of the environment. There are people that are asking deeper questions, that are applying that same line of thinking that they apply to their beef and their chicken. How was it grown? What did it eat? What did it eat? And what is the nutritional value? You know, when was it harvested? Ask just more questions about seafood. Apply the same line of thinking that you do to your chicken and your beef and your tomatoes to your seafood. And you'll be able to say no to commodity farmed and yes to farms that are doing it right. And that's the exciting work that I'm a part of today. And I'm excited because there are farms reaching out to us now proactively saying, hey man, you guys are the only outlet that we've found that is willing to pay for what we're doing and how we're doing it. And every other importer and distributor and retailer has told us, dude, the system's not broke. Don't try to fix it. Just keep producing more volume. And if you can lower the price, we'll buy it. And that is not an incentive to evolution. It's not an incentive to innovation. We need consumers. We need a group of consumers willing to pay for healthy seafood, the healthiest seafood, quantifiably nutrient rich, quantifiably clean, and hopefully voting also for specific practices that are part of the solution. Because the writing's on the wall. Like, we can't feed the world with industrial wild caught seafood. Like, we have to, I'm not saying like don't support artisan local fisheries, but the need to develop solutions that are truly scalable are paramount, right? Like, there's a finite supply of wild seafood. That number actually plateaued in 2002. We have not increased the quantity of seafood harvested from the ocean since 2002. The number is actually going down. There's just a finite supply, right? Like, since World War II, we've been using sonar and we've been using spotter planes, and we've just been using all this technology developed for warfare to very efficiently mine the oceans for seafood. But there's a plateau and there's diminishing returns if we put too much pressure on it. We're seeing the collapse of species. I mean, I mean, we're kind of in like the sixth great extinction era, right? Like there's species are going extinct every 20 minutes during this podcast. How many species are going to go extinct? If we do things right, if we have more regenerative practices, if we optimize for ecosystem services, we can actually produce food systems that are scalable and have a net positive impact. And that gets me excited. That's beautiful. You know, that is the legacy that I'm endeavoring to build. You know, I have two little girls. One is due. One is still in the oven. She's due in a month. One is old enough that, you know, we go to the tide pools and we're having a good time and playing. And I want her to see some of the things that I got to see when I was a kid. I got to see abundant environments. You know, my earliest memories are traveling down the Baja Peninsula with my father and free diving in the Sea of Cortez, and him going down and cutting up shellfish and just masses of fish coming around. And we were catching fish one after another without even bait on our hooks. We literally had soda cans with a string and a hook, and you just drop it off the side of our inflatable boat and you pull up a fish after fish after fish. And then we would get scallops, and we just ate, cooked on the beach, and felt like I was just in this wonderland, you know. And to have those experiences and the experiences I've had traveling, I've had the opportunity to sail to the Galapagos, and I've explored the whole Pacific coast. Well, not the whole Pacific coast, the Eastern Pacific from California to Chile. And things are changing rapidly. And if we can create more marine protected areas and allow nature to rebuild her resilience, and do this in a like pragmatic, impactful today, we're making these investments. Like, one of the cool things about Seatopia is we're actually planting kelp with every single order, which is really exciting. We planted over 7,000 kelp last season. Awesome. These things are measurable, and it might be small, but relatively, like, we built kelp forest, right? And I want my kids to go diving in a kelp forest in a marine protected area that we created and see abundance. So we can do that, right? We can build extensive farms and integrated multi-trophic aquaculture farms and feed fish healthy nutrients that are creating this, that are fostering this abundance. It just requires a little bit more thought on, you know, where we want to vote with our dollars. But each of us are voting 3 times a day. I mean, you guys are speaking this every single day with these other brands, right? Like, I'm excited to think about the potential for more regenerative seafood brands, because on this blue planet that we all live on, even though we are, you know, on land and we feel comfortable on land, we are tied to the ocean. It is intrinsically connected to every second breath that we take is oxygen produced from the ocean. You know, it controls the climate. It is the largest potential lever for climate mitigation, right? Like, I truly appreciate the work that a lot of these farmers are doing on land, but every time they say that carbon storage in the soil is the largest ecosystem service that you can do, it is omitting the fact that we live on a blue planet. And if we can catalyze ecosystem services in the ocean, man, we have potential to really rapidly change our relationship to the ocean, to climate, on this planet. I mean, the ocean has the power to change climate, period.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It almost feels like, yeah, I'd be curious if there's a stat, like the number of people who have actually gone in the ocean on the planet. You know, is that 25% of people, humans on the planet? Is that 10%? Like, what is that number? And when you start thinking about the whole planet as a potential resource and or catalyst for positive change, like it's almost like you're unlocking a map that didn't exist, because to your point, like, we're all land-based animals, right?
Yeah.
Or at least today, for the most part. So yeah, thinking about the ocean as an avenue to create positive change and mitigate climate change is, I think, something that most people just don't go there because that's not where they spend their time.
No. This disconnection from nature is the crux of our problem, right? It's like, we
removed ourselves from our
health.
ecosystem. Yeah, so we no longer understand the impact the decisions we make, especially with what we eat, how that affects the rest of everything else around us in those systems.
Yeah, and I think we also can't be perfectionist about it, because the unlock to me when researching Seatopia and like getting ready for the episode was, if I'm only going to eat wild caught seafood, then I shouldn't eat regenerative beef anymore. I should just eat venison. I should hunt elk. I should, go to Yellowstone and try and get myself a bison. Like it's the same thing. So you can't say, hey, we can have rich stewarded polyculture environments that produce abundant food and ecosystem services on land, but say like, oh, we shouldn't do that in aquaculture either, which was really the big unlock for me, was the multi-trophic aquaculture, being related to polyculture or even permaculture, of like, oh shit, okay, that's like, when I think of aquaculture or seafood right now, I basically think of wild caught or farm raised, and farm raised just being a monoculture. And that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about doing it in a totally different way. That's circular, that's regenerative, that the human being is still involved in that process, as the caretaker, as the person kind of moving it forward while producing
involved, but not on the top, right? Involved.
Right.
Like, we are part of it. We're learning how it works. We are stewards. We are not the owners. Yeah. I'm so glad that you brought up that analogy of being a hunter, right? Like, I've been a hunter since I was a teenager, and I appreciate it. With the intimate experience of taking the life of an animal, you have this humility and this sense of remorse and guilt and connection and responsibility. It's important, and people should have that experience if you're going to choose to eat beef or chicken or any animal, right? Having that connection is really important. But to also say that you're going to eat farmed animals that you haven't asked deeper questions, right? And you're going to say, I'm only going to eat wild caught venison, is not scalable, right? We can't all just eat wild bison, for example. That proved to be detrimental to the entire population of bison, right? Like, there used to be a respected job called a market hunter. They would go into the wild and hunt animals, often buffalo, and bring them back into the cities. That collapsed because it wasn't scalable, right? Like, farming done right has the ability to scale food systems. Done right is the important question. And if we apply those same principles, should we all continue to only eat wild caught seafood? Well, we can't, right? If you want to eat salmon, if everybody continued to just eat wild salmon, we would deplete the entire population of wild salmon in less than a season, right? Some of these runs, like Copper River salmon, sometimes they don't even open up the whole run for a year. Like, the quotas are so small because the resource is finite and they're under threat. So thank you for painting that analogy. And I'm glad that we are creating these analogies that people can shift the way they think about seafood, because we have this extra layer of confusion and misinformation in the aquaculture industry that you don't have in land-based. So there's one challenge, which is like farmed, commodity factory farm versus artisan regenerative integrated multi-trophic polyculture. That's okay. We have to understand that there's optionality, that there's different types of farming practices. But in the seafood world, we have this additional layer of confusion and misinformation that stems from the fact that there's still a very rich and robust wild-caught fishery that feels threatened from farmed fish. And it's this infighting and this sort of tribalism between wild fisheries that are trying to say, hey, what we're doing is sustainable and we're doing our best to sustain it, and our entire communities are dependent on this, and this is part of our culture and our history. And then you have farmers who are saying, well, cool, but we also are trying to build something that is scalable and sustainable. And we think that this is the future. And they're both competing for the same buyers. And there's all this infighting and miscommunication. And that makes it very confusing. And there's data from grocery stores that say people come into the fish market section and they're overwhelmed by the messaging and they opt for something else. They go and get beef or chicken or pork. And that confusion is a big challenge because seafood is healthy. It's one of the healthiest proteins you can get when done right. It can also be a scalable food system. But this confusion of like, should I eat wild caught versus should I eat farmed, and what farms are good versus bad, just adds this complexity. So as a business, Seatopia does not sell any wild caught seafood, not because I'm going to say that, hey, wild caught is bad. It's that there's enough demand already for wild caught seafood. What is missing, in my opinion, and why Seatopia exists, is a source of what are the best farms and what are the best farming practices and how do I choose those and how do I vote for those? Because if we can educate consumers on how to buy seafood better from the best farms that are scalable food systems, that are feeding them nutritious ingredients, that are doing integrated multi-trophic aquaculture, then we can help create a healthier relationship with seafood. So
yes, I mean, I am emblematic of the exact problem that you're talking about. You know, I moved to Thailand for a while, became a dive master, learned about what commercial fishing was like in third world countries, and decided I'm not going to eat any seafood. I'm not going to eat anything that comes out of the ocean because I can't support these practices. And at the same time, I knew that, I guess you called it aquaculture 2.0, is not necessarily the best from a nutritional density perspective and or an environmental perspective. So I was like, I'm just done with seafood for now. And then in my own consumer education journey, I started to understand that there are certain companies and organizations who are doing it right, especially in like the bivalves and the shellfish world. And now continuing to learn more about these integrative, I can't even say the term right, integrative polyculture, multiculture, farm systems, multi-trophic. There you go. And this comes back to my point. Like in this world where there's these two binaries that are against each other, neither of which are really poised as heroes. How do you educate consumers about like, hey, we're sort of walking the line in between these two things. We're farmed, but we're farmed, 3.0, we're better. How do you get consumers to buy into that? And what sort of messaging has really resonated so far? And why do you feel like it's successful?
What's working for us is what we're learning through this journey is that talking about sustainability and regenerative practices, we get a lot of like, that's nice, good, cool, like, oh, maybe we'll write an article about it, but it doesn't drive dollars, and this is the challenge that a lot of my friends that are building regenerative ag brands face is like, how do we get dollars, not just like pat on the backs, like, oh, good for you, this is good for the planet. Talking to like impact investors and people who are like saying that they want to do good for the planet. It's cool and all, but you have to build a financially sustainable business. And who is really going to pay for these better farming practices? Carnivorous fish, the feed is the single most expensive part of the farming operation, right? So if you're going to increase the cost of the feed by going from subsidized corn and soy to something like algae-based oils and insect proteins, you have a significant increase in cost. What about, the astaxanthin that's in there? Like salmon, for example, get their color from what they eat, right? The astaxanthin is a red algae that gives the color to things like shrimp and crabs and salmon eventually as they get consumed by them. And you can feed astaxanthin to salmon. Well, natural versus synthetic astaxanthin. These are really this is important questions to ask. Like, are consumers going to pay for natural astaxanthin to get a beautiful, rich color that is natural and actually has the natural antioxidants. I actually take astaxanthin personally as a supplement. It's a healthy thing. A lot of people do. It's a nutrient, an antioxidant people take.
Just for the listeners at home, James does not have a reddish hue about his skin. It doesn't seem to affect him the same way it affects the shellfish. Sorry to interrupt.
It does have some interesting benefits, at least some studies, and why I was originally introduced to it, surprisingly, is that it also helps build up your tolerance to the sun and helps with melanin. So you're less likely to get sunburn when you're taking astaxanthin. I'm not a doctor, but this is there are some studies that have shown this, and this is how I was first introduced to it. But that said, the feed inputs are very expensive. And to get people to pay for better quality farming just on a basis of environmental or social impact that doesn't affect their lives is tricky. So one of the things that we learned over time was that the nutrient density of these animals, the cleanliness of these animals can also be quantified. And so what we've been doing is really focusing on quantifying the cleanliness of seafood and the nutritional value of seafood, and providing this certificate of analysis on our website and providing this source of seafood that is all certified clean results in people wanting to pay for fish that is going to be healthier and cleaner for their household, right? Like if you had two options and one was potentially infected with glyphosates and the other one was grown without glyphosates, are you going to pay more for the clean one? The same thing we're doing with aquaculture. It's like one has mercury and PCBs and microplastics, and the other one, here's a certificate of analysis, quantifiably no microplastics at detectable levels, quantifiable levels of mercury that are magnitudes lower than FDA's guidelines, the right ratio of omega-3s to omega-6s. That's what we're doing with Seatopia, and that's actually working. So the funny thing is that we've evolved from even talking about regenerative, sustainable to just like, this is certified clean. And this is what consumers are willing to pay for, is what we found. People are actually willing to pay for, at least in a very niche audience, there are some people who are willing to pay for quantifiably cleaner, more nutrient-rich foods. And that is, at this point in our journey, enough to catalyze farms to make these investments and building our little supply chain of farms that want to be part of this movement. And hey, if we keep doing this over time, it will scale. The potential is there to be bigger, but it's an early chapter in a very long journey.
Yeah, I feel like just harvesting some themes that are very clearly tied in, whether it's Seatopia or really all the brands we've talked about. It's like this need to break out of the commodity system because you're doing something different. The fact that the regenerative story and the altruistic benefits of the environmental outcomes doesn't drive purchase. And then the need to translate that into something else that consumer cares more about, that's more of a personal self-interest. And it's very clear, like that is the way we're going to have commercial success, at least in the short term, for these businesses, which if they don't have commercial success, they can't continue to do the good altruistic work. So, it's that's all very clear. I think an interesting thing that's coming to mind for me, and I was happy you kind of prompted the glyphosate comparison, is I almost think what you're doing in seafood right now, James, is more compared to what organic did in farming than what we're doing in regenerative farming. Like, to me, land-based ag regenerative is 4.0. Organic was 3.0. And so you're almost trying to differentiate with consumers that there's multiple types of farming, which we've already accomplished in land-based ag with organic, with that seal of like toxicity free, which I'm not surprised that's how it's translated for you with consumers. Right. And so you're actually trying to do both, which I think is very challenging, because like organic kind of paved the way already for regenerative in a way. And you're doing what I think organic and regenerative have both tried to do on land-based ag. So I don't know. Hope that made sense. It made sense in my brain before I said it, but.
Yeah, no, it's definitely important to have that optionality, right? And just starting with like what's not in it is really important, right? Mm-hmm. Like if there's not antibiotics, if there's not hormones, if there's not mercury, if there's not microplastics, that's a much better option, right? Like, and absolutely the USDA organic protocols are just like what's not in it. And that's kind of what we're doing with Seatopia. Also, if we can quantify like this is more nutrient dense, how do we say that this is, has more omega-3s than other leading brands or than the FDA studies on, wild-caught comparatives of same species? That is something that we're tiptoeing into and exploring. But it is very difficult to sell people, is what I found, on regenerative practices. People it's at this point, environmentally friendly, sustainable, like these terms, they're sort of like table stakes for our audience. It's like, if it's not that, I'm not going to buy it, but I expect Seatopia to at least be that. But why I keep coming back to Seatopia, why I keep coming back is the certified cleanliness and the nutrient value. And that is something that we're still trying to work on, right? Like, how do we literally, like, it comes again back to like, to build a market for better farming practices, it has to impact the consumer in a way that they're willing to make investments with their dollars. And health is the only thing that we've found thus far that really drives purchase. So what are the superfoods in seafood, right? What is the super feed? How do we produce the most nutrient dense seafood on the planet, right? How do we create these ecosystems that, cool, they have ecosystem benefits, they're sequestering carbon, they're offsetting ocean acidification, they're creating biodiversity, they're fish attracting devices, all these things. But how do we produce fish that are better than other fish that people will actually pay for? Because, oh, that's cool, doesn't pay the bills.
Totally.
But a lot of our customers are paying a lot of money for their biohacking and for their longevity. And if you can produce seafood that has the traditional historical benefits of the sort of blue zone Mediterranean diet, that has more omega-3s and EPA and DHA and the selenium and the lysine and the vitamin A and the vitamin D, that is going to be more bioavailable than a pill form, that's interesting. Because there's a very big difference in like the triglyphosate versus, a shelf-stable form of omega-3 capsule or oil. Some of these omega-3s are very fragile, and the long-chain omega-3s oxidize relatively easily. So what if you just super freeze this with nitrogen and serve it as a sushi grade piece of fish, and you actually get all the nutrients in this bioavailable form and can quantify it? And that's kind of where we're at today. It's like, how do you produce superfoods through creating the best environment and quantify it? Because that's what I want, at least, right? And maybe it's at this point sort of a niche audience and it is more expensive, but these systems with economies of scale are very, very interesting, and they can scale. So yeah, that's what we're learning.
I think you're spot on. And it's a really interesting kind of thought exercise or thought experiment where, like, if you think about the supplement industry and how massive that industry is and how big it has been, maybe to your point, today's audience who's like people who are looking for true like nutrition and food, it might be small. But if you can build the bridge that gets that audience to the people who spend hundreds of thousands of dollars a year on supplements, and get people to understand, like, hey, if you're consuming real food that's actually nutrient dense, maybe you don't need to spend that much money on your supplements. Like, that changes the equation for people. And if you think about like pantry share, if you will, or how much money people spend on food and or supplements, if you can reallocate those dollars to pay the premium on something like seafood or regenerative beef or, those really nutrient dense foods, you're then supporting those systems that have the positive ecological benefit as well. Right. So I think it's really interesting to go down that rabbit hole. And I think there's some technology coming out in the future where like nutrient density testing is going to become much more like widely available. And you are well poised for that world. You give me like a big thumbs up. So like, how are you thinking about that future and what you're doing?
Yeah. I mean, like I'm thinking about the world where you take out your phone and you can just take a photo and you can see, like with an app, the nutrient density, the bioavailability of something. That is going to be a game changer, right? When labels are one thing and you're like kind of trusting a third party, lab, whatever, but to actually have real-time data and see that is going to be a game changer, and people are going to vote for what's actually healthiest, most nutrient dense, right? Like
I'm both super stoked for that future and also annoyed because I'm going to be sitting there like in the produce aisle, like scanning every single apple. Like I want to make sure that I pick the most nutrient dense one. You know what I mean?
That's great.
I mean, we should, because then we're incentivizing the producers of food to focus on nutrient density rather than yield. And that changes the way we think about our environment and our food systems and the whole nine. So yeah, I agree. That's going to be a huge unlock for the health of our species and our planet and every species on the planet.
Yeah. And it also paints some really interesting things for us, like practicality, like the distribution logistics of fresh seafood are part of what has created this sort of commodity seafood distribution thing, because fresh seafood is really difficult to distribute. It's almost impossible to do it well because it's such a fragile protein, right? So we've opted just to do super frozen seafood. Frozen seafood traditionally has this stigma associated to it because if you put a piece of fish in your home freezer and you freeze it, it's going to be very different than what happens when you put it in a nitrogen freezer, a blast freezer, an IQF freezer. Freezing it with this technology that brings it down to negative 70 degrees or delivering it with dry ice, and it never fluctuates. I mean, the challenges of communicating that frozen seafood can be sushi grade are also significant. And it's partially because there's this perception that at the fish market, the fish that's fresh is fresh. But like if it was caught on any sort of industrial commercial boat that was out at sea for more than one day, I guarantee they froze it, right? A lot of these boats go out to sea for, a month, multiple months at a time. They didn't leave that fresh. It was frozen. And then it was refreshed. But the question that you don't have visibility to is how long ago was it refreshed? And was it refreshed more than once? Like, did they not sell it and then refreeze it and then put it out fresh again? And that has created this perception that fresh is best. And it's also created this terrible association of fishy fish being normal, right? Fish don't smell fishy in the ocean, right? This like fishy smell means that it started to oxidize, right? If fish is smelly and stinky, it's not good. Like that is not sushi grade delicious seafood, right? Like don't let your friends eat fishy fish. There's so many people who say, oh, my wife doesn't like fish, or I don't like fish. And they just haven't had good fish, right? You don't go to the ocean and be like, oh, it smells fishy, unless there's like some sort of like die-off happening at the shoreline. In the ocean, it smells like the ocean. And when fish is harvested and handled correctly and frozen, and you defrost it correctly and you wick the moisture and you put it out, it should smell like the terroir of the ocean, right? It shouldn't smell fishy. The terroir is like what we get in wine, right? The terroir is the character of the minerality in that water. And fish hold a lot of water in them. Compared to beef, there's a lot more water. So the water and how we freeze that water is very important. We could also go down like a weird rabbit hole of how nerdy we get about like the structure of water and the energy in water, but I don't know how much time we have to go on those tangents.
That sounds like an awesome rabbit hole for a different podcast, but I would love to go down that. That'd be really cool. So what's next for Seatopia in terms of, how do you see your business growing? Is it getting more of the fisheries to do it the right way? Sorry, not fisheries, but the aquaculture operations to do it the right way? Are you looking to like specifically get a specific new type of fish into your system? How do you think about growth, and what's your path to getting where you want to be?
Right now, we're just aggregating this sort of niche audience of buyers who are willing to pay for these better practices, and focusing that on the handful of farms that are willing to make these investments. There's a handful of these farms that have these pilot projects or these small commercial projects that are not financially scalable yet, right? They need more scale. They need economies of scale. They need buyers who are willing to pay. So what we're doing right now is, in some cases, like providing purchase orders in advance to help farms transition to better farming practices, right? You can't turn this huge ship right away. You have to come to a farm that already has concessions and already is profitably selling, to, their commodity Costco distribution and food service stuff, but they're willing to make a bet with, let's call it like a percentage of their land, their territory, their concessions, and say, hey, on these lots, we're willing to make these investments in doing integrated multi-trophic aquaculture and using algae-based feeds and soldier fly larvae, but it's going to increase our production costs XYZ, at least initially, right? And until we can prove that a handful of these farms are wildly successful and financially, on all levels, then it's going to be a slow transition. So we're just trying to support these handful of farms that are making those investments, prove that it is economically viable. And so, our kind of internal goal is to like convert 1% of the US seafood consumption to regenerative aquaculture products. And that's kind of ambitious at this stage, but over time, I do believe that we will demonstrate that these farms doing it right get tremendous value in not only the ecosystem services that the bivalves and the kelp in proximity to the finfish provide, but to their brand and to the actual products. Like selling through commodity distribution doesn't really, you give away all your power, right? How do we bring the power back? How do we allow the farms to set the price? How do we allow them to build great farm stories, great farm brands, and make these long investments? So we're right now aggregating demand, supporting the handful of farms, growing awareness, and that's kind of the journey that we're at. It's still pretty early stages. Our hope that is in a couple of years there'll be a 10x increase in farms using these practices, and just growing methodically but sort of aggressively. But it is a small niche in a huge wheel of seafood consumption at this stage.
James, is product development or product innovation or like package or process items a part of that? I mean, you're focused on, I don't know what the proper seafood term is, but like the prime cuts or the fillets or whatever. But like to get there, do we need people to eat fish broth or like, I don't even know. I don't know enough about the space to even throw some examples.
Eyeballs,
at you, but
tongue,
what is
cheek.
That like?
Yeah, everything. Yeah, I'm glad that you appreciate that. I mean, we don't have to, but from a operations perspective, if you take a whole fish and you just take the center cut fillets off, you're getting, that's like 40% of the animal. So 60% needs to have another outlet, and just sending it to cat dog food. Cool. I love my dog, but how do you get a premium market for those things? And there's a lot of innovation there that's happening. I'm glad that you brought up the broth thing. Like, it's interesting to note that there's more collagen in fish bones than there is in chicken bones even. Like, it's incredible when you when you do a broth from a clean fish, you actually can produce a lot of collagen, and fish broth is really delicious. And cooking with fish broth and making dashi from a clean fish is an incredible product. So how do we get more awareness and demand for products like that? Mm-hmm. How about livers, right? Like the liver of a clean fed salmon or kampachi is absolutely delicious and nutrient dense. I mean, there's a reason why in the wild, whether that's like killer whales or sharks, like eating the liver first, like they know that's where the nutrients are, right? So clean liver incorporated into hot dogs and things of that nature, like let's do that. And hearts as well. Like we've been eating these things for years, but how do we create a packaged product that consumers want to appreciate and would appreciate? Really interesting opportunity there. The nose tail utilization is innovating. There's some interesting things on utilizing skin for making leathers. There are some companies making beautiful leathers out of the fish skins.
Wow.
Personally, I like to eat the fish skins, but there's a lot of innovation there. It's ripe for growth. We're just scratching the surface on the diversity of products, and doing that, if we can increase utilization and yield efficiency, it helps the company tremendously. There's also a lot of innovation that needs to be done on valuing ecosystem services, right? Like I was just talking to a mussel farmer that has the largest concession in North America in federal waters to do this huge mussel farm, and they're not able to get to market right now because regulatory challenges of quantifying whether or not it's safe for human consumption at this point. But like in the interim, they could have these mussels in the water just providing the ecosystem services of cleaning the environment and creating habitat. But until we start valuing those things as a society, it's sitting fallow. This is just like open. They have this concession, they have millions of dollars invested, but they're not growing these mussels. And every time you grow mussels, that shell is being formed through the process of calcification that's pulling carbon out of the ocean, offsetting ocean acidification. They're filtering that water and they're creating habitat that is attractive to other species. When we do these things, we are benefiting the environment. But until we have other structures that really value that, a lot of these projects are just sitting there dormant. So there's R&D side on the product development, also like sort of societal governmental policy things that need to evolve as well. It's also worth noting on that subject, there's no finfish farms in North America that have been permitted, and that is a challenge that is going to take a long time to resolve because there's so much stigma against it that, like the California Coastal Commission, for example, I had the opportunity to present to them our vision for aquaculture, and the same vision that I shared with NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association. And they were like, this is beautiful. You get it, integrated multi-trophic aquaculture done right, sort of creating food for the local communities and a net positive impact on the environment. If we, define permitting that way, that requires these sort of, any finfish permit should be required to have a equal or greater bioremediative, nutrient uptake of shellfish and kelp, on that same permitted site to have a net positive impact. When I shared the same presentation to California Coastal Commission, they just shot arrows at me like I was the devil or something, because they are of this age that believes that all aquaculture is bad. We're in this really cool campus for blue economy businesses here in LA and in San Pedro, right on the water, called Alta Sea. And we have the fortune of having a lot of school, elementary, middle school, high school, and college students come and visit and tour the facility. And it is incredible to see the next generation knows about aquaculture and appreciates the nuances of aquaculture in a way that our generation and older generations just don't. So I'm very optimistic that this next generation that's in elementary school right now and is learning about aquaculture with modern textbooks that are talking about the importance of raising fish in healthy systems, and we're teaching, or they're getting a chance to like see this is algae-based oil, these are kelp, and these are shellfish, and they're seeing these things and understanding, appreciating how they work together. That generation is going to be a different voter, and when those voters come into positions of coastal commission permitting and whatnot, I think we'll have the opportunity to evolve our relationship to producing seafood in North America in a healthier way.
Totally.
I mean, I think you just answered the last question, but I feel like I got to ask it now, but I feel like you just answered it.
Well, hold on. Before we go there, I can't help but think from a product innovation perspective, and maybe this is because our last episode was Maui Nui venison, but it feels to me like an ancestral blend fish stick with fish organs, could be a way to get like more nutrient-dense food to the masses, right? Just throwing it out there.
100%.
Good work.
It's in R&D. It is such a good product. Do we make it shelf stable, or is it a hot dog? Is it frozen? All of those things are really interesting. And I can tell you, we've made some sausages in-house that are just delicious using hearts and livers and the head meat. Culturally, if you go to, there's this cool story of like in China when they would where they're trying to find a caravan was going across the land, and these robbers came up and they wanted to find who was the leader, the king, the rich, and he had clothed himself like the commoners, so they didn't know who he was, and they shared a meal, and they just watched who ate and how they ate, and the wealthy nobleman knew that the most delicate, rich part of a fish was the head, and they ate the head first. And just watching that, they were able to identify, hey, this is the educated nobleman, and the other people who ate, the other portion first were less educated.
Wow.
The head meat on fish is divine. It has all these little structural, the anatomy of the bones creates these little pockets of meat that holds the fat and the nutrients, so that when you cook it, it's just always moist and delicious. So when you cut a head off and just throw it away or give it to dog food, you're oftentimes giving away the best parts, right? So I have a friend who's the chef at this restaurant in LA called Holbosch, which he takes the whole carcass, and after he takes the fillets off, he then smokes it. And then it's a labor intensive process, but then picks all the meat off the head and off the carcass and in between the bones. And that meat that's in between bones, just like your bone-in steaks, that meat is the most delicious. And then you take that and you can make pâtés. There's so many things that you can do with that. It's just a matter of will, really. And labor costs.
The miroir. I'm going to use that so much now, but marine version. And it seems like the culinary applications are pretty endless and still underdeveloped. Super fun conversation, James. Just to take us home, I feel like you did kind of already answer it, but curious what else you have to add to it. The question that we kind of close and ask everyone is, how do we get Regen Brands to have 50% market share by 2050?
Feels ambitious because James is aiming for 1% of the North American seafood industry, but still want to hear the answer.
Hey, that's a part of it, getting to that 50, dog.
Hey, 25 years it's a blink, but it's also going to happen quickly. I mean, look what happened with COVID. You had one virus change culture, right? We'd have one bacterial change people's perceptions to eating anything that has antibiotics in it, right? Like it could change overnight. Like the Earth is going to do what she's going to do, right? We are trying to predict what's going to happen in the future, but I mean, how would we change? How would culture change if all of a sudden our perception of antibiotics shifted to like, oh, if you have anything that has antibiotics in it, it's you're going to lower your immune system. Just some of us know that. But that knowing and feeling and firsthand experience spreading through an entire society, through culture, what are the things that nature is going to do, and how do we respond to it? I don't know. That's sort of a dark potentially answer. Let's be more optimistic. I mean, pragmatic approach that we can affect change, because on the other parallel track, like, yeah, the ecology and Earth's going to do what she's going to do, but it is an education piece. It's a long game, but I'm optimistic that it's a combination of policy changes and education and also technology, right? Having that technology to be able to quantify the cleanliness, the nutrient density, the bioavailability, those three sort of levers. If we can continue to push pragmatically in those, I think it's very possible. My vision for 1% is not that 25 years from now. I think we can get there much faster than that. But yeah, as we continue to talk to NOAA and talk to, policymakers, there is an U.S. Aquaculture Act that is in Congress, and we'll see what happens with the changing administration. But there is a desire. It's all from a policy perspective. The funny thing that shifts the powers that be is usually this subject of food sovereignty and being able to produce our own food. And seafood is primarily imported in the US, and being able to produce it ourselves and not be dependent on that sovereignty thing gets documents signed. On a consumer side of the demand, it's, I think, education about health and then technology to actually quantify that and make that like really evident. Those are areas that I think we can have some control and action in. And trusting that doing things right by the earth, that there's some sort of karmic, symbiotic, catalytic response, right? As we support other players in this ecosystem and we continue to create this culture, it has this flywheel effect, and I'm optimistic in that regard.
Yeah, I love the positive call out to the tech and the nutrient density tie-in, because we've talked about it ad nauseum in all the episodes, but I don't know if anyone's ever put it in their answer to that final question. We've talked about policy and education a lot, and they're mandatory for us to hit that goal. But it seems like, that the nutrient density and the missing technology to kind of help it proliferate is also a very nodal kind of intervention point. So I love that you included that one.
Yeah, I also think it's really interesting, the COVID parallel, right? I'm not at all advocating that this should happen. I do not want it to happen. But to your point, the power of something outside of our control, changing the way consumers perceive health, food, nutrition, whatever, could be like the catalyst we need to rethink our food systems, right? So interesting answer we haven't heard before. But, in either case, we super appreciate the time, James. Like, for those who want to learn more, Seatopia.fish. I can't wait to buy some of my first cuts. And thank you so much for the time, man. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you guys for helping shift consumer demand awareness and helping other brands and farmers like learn and work together, because it's going to take all of us working together, right? We're still a minority of consumer power and buying power, but as we continue to educate and support these other brands, these other farms, we're making waves. So thank you guys.
Amen, brother. Thanks for joining us.
Much appreciated. Much love.
For show notes, episode transcripts, and more information on our guests and what we discuss on the show, check out our website, regen-brands.com. That is regen-brands.com. You can also find our Regen recaps on the website. Regen recaps take less than 5 minutes to read and cover all the key points of the full hour-long conversations. You can check out our YouTube channel, Regen Brands Podcast, for all of our episodes with both video and audio. The best way to support our work is to give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform, subscribe to future episodes, and share the show with your friends. Thanks for tuning in to the Regen Brands Podcast, brought to you by the Regen Coalition and Outlaw Ventures. We hope you learned something new in this episode, and it empowers you to use your voice, your time, and your dollars to help us build a better and more regenerative food system. Love you guys.